Hello, welcome to this week's edition of Game Speak. I'm Layman Kingsford, and today I thought I'd chat a little bit about sort of queer representation in the tabletop game industry. Ironically, somebody started a thread on Board Game Geek in the Rainbow Gamers sub-thread forum for queer gamers on this very subject. So I thought, funny, I'm going to be talking about this later today. So I commented on it, and we'll see what comes of it. But brings up the notion of how should LGBTQ plus people be represented in games, and what are the best methods? And it's my feeling that in general, it's pretty challenging. It's tricky because for the most part, what sets us apart as queer folk from everybody else is not visual stuff. It's more based upon our behavior, who we love in life, those sorts of things. Unlike diversity and representation in gaming, for like racial diversity, if you've got games that are depicting characters, it's much easier to represent, make sure you've got representations of all sorts of different kinds of people in the games, and because the differences are visual. But for us, it's more behavioral and or cultural. So how do you go about in a game that has 8 characters in it? How do you represent one or more of them as queer, or should you? My argument would be, well, yeah, we should, but can we? Because most games aren't about character relationships, and most, if not many, games don't have enough of a narrative drive to even depict relationships, straight, gay, or otherwise. So is it even relevant? Because if we're just going to depict people visually, characters, we run the risk of depicting stereotypes, which can be quite harmful. For example, like in a game with 8 characters, you have one female appearing character but with short hair and a tool belt and say, hey, that's my queer lesbian representation. That doesn't seem cool. Or some twinkie boy character in a little crop top and booty shorts. Well, that doesn't seem fair either, because we're not about what we look like. It's about who we are and who we choose to love. Which is the same as everybody. You choose to love somebody, right? And it's their gender or their orientation are not the most relevant part of that. For many people, for straight people, they presume everybody is straight, right? So in games, how do we go about showcasing that? I don't know. In a game that's very narrative driven, then yeah, if we're talking about characters' relationships, if there is a ruler of a fantasy land, there's a king. Maybe the king has a husband instead of a wife as the queen. They could still be called queen. Make up a different term for the king's spouse. What if the land is ruled by a queen? The queen could have a wife. There's also ways to, I think, maybe stop focusing so much on gender representation or gender definition, and just depict characters, and focus as little as possible on their gender, because then it doesn't matter. So I'm going to change screens here. In gaming, for the most part, those of us who are queer have to just imagine for ourselves that, so here's an example. I just got this today, Mute Insurrection, haven't played it yet. Huge XMen fan. So what if, we've always had to imagine, well, what if Cyclops and Wolverine were together? Well, this game isn't going to be about their personal relationship, I don't think, because it's a superhero game, so it's about heroes fighting the bad guys. So does it matter that in the current iterations of X-Men, I believe, I'm certainly not up to date, but that Cyclops, Wolverine, and Jean Grey have something of a 3-way sort of polyamorous thing going on? So that's cool that the comics are doing that, but those are telling the stories of the characters themselves, not their actions. So and some versions of Iceman have been gay. Does that matter in this particular game? I don't think so, not at all, because this game is presumably not about that whatsoever. Most games are not going to be about those subject matters. So, it's such a tough question. Does that matter or doesn't it? I think where in games that it does matter, things like this Martinis Men, which I used to own a game store. We picked this up back in 2006 when we first opened. This game was just coming out, and I went to a convention and talked to the creators of it, and their intent was to have secondary versions of it that were the gay version, queer versions of it. The premise of this game is it's just if I can get it open, deck of cards and a couple of dice, and it's a total party game. So you've got guy cards and girl cards, and they each have 2 traits on them. Like this one, she's a yuppie and she's outdoorsy, and this guy is a hippie and spiritual. And you're trying to match up pairs and I think if I remember correctly, you're trying to get 3 couples married by the end of the game, and the dice rolls determine whether they date, break up, or get married. Again, perpetuating that marriage is always the goal of all relationships, which for many people it is. For many of us it is not. Though we, speaking as the gays, do appreciate that for the most part we have the legal ability to marry just like everybody else, even if we choose, like the straight folk, to not follow through on that, because it doesn't have to be the end goal. But anyway, the purpose of this game is you're trying to match up these couples. We tried playing it where you could match up blues and reds together. It doesn't really work just because of the structure of the game, the number of traits each card has. It kind of broke the game. But I think in games like this is where it's absolutely about relationships. Having a version of this game, or even the original version, I'm not sure I don't think this even exists anymore. This matchmaking game you should be able to match up with whoever you want. If you're playing with a group of people that are all straight and only want to match up the men with women, cool. But if you're a group of only lesbians playing and you just want to match up the women with the women, and the object is trying to get rid of as many of the male cards as possible, cool. What if you don't identify as male or female and you don't care about whether you're matching up with one of them? Doesn't matter. So games like this is where that sort of representation and thinking does matter, and I would argue is crucial. In games I've produced, which are very queer-centric, Houseboy and Drag Show. Now, Drag Show is a very, very simple game, so it is intended to be a drinking game. I've tried to play it under the auspices of sobriety without drinking. It's not much of a game, because a drinking game by its very nature needs to be moronically simple. And because it's so simple, if you're not distracted by having a few too many tequila shots, the game has a propensity to go on too long. Speaking of tequila, I'm going to have some coffee. Doesn't have tequila. I just need the coffee. But that's queer representation right there, because drag is quintessentially queer, right? Houseboy. I've designed that one for my fellow gay males. Though, interestingly, in all these years, have just as much fun playing it with straight women, and even lesbians, too. So this game still, despite the fact that it only depicts male-on-male relationships, the game itself appeals to really most everybody we've played with. And my lesbian friends keep asking, so when are you going to do a lesbian version of this? And I go, well, I will at some point when I find the right artist. I'm not sure thematically it appeals in the same way, because dudes, whether hetero or gay, we kind of operate on the same premise. Just trying to get hooked up, right? Or just trying to hook up. Anyway, so these are games that I have created and published, that are queer-centric. But outside of that, I think it's super challenging to represent that. Also come in contact with a game designer in England who has designed a drag show card game called Drags to Riches. He's straight male, but has designed the game actively with his queer friends, and it's really a distillation of RuPaul's Drag Race, in a card game format, um, and he's catching flack from people from the queer community, from some portions of the queer community, because there's some of us are supportive of him as an ally because he's going about it the right way. He's soliciting input from the queer community and from the drag community, making sure that what he's doing with the game isn't actually harming anyone. Because he's really the sort of ally I think we want to have and support and be there holding hands alongside us, not speaking for us, but speaking along with us, adding their voices to ours in our quest for equality and diversity representation. Anyway, so he's got this game, and it doesn't represent what me and my people do in drag. His game represents only queens, his current version, his first version, though he's totally open to doing other versions in the future, much like that Martinis Men. If there's success, then doing other versions that are more inclusive of all sorts of drag, not just drag queens. Because I myself am a drag king, and I'm something of a rarity. I'm a cisgendered male that has a drag persona that is perceived as male. I consider myself a drag king, so I'm really rare. And much of the drag community looks down upon me because they think, well, that's not really drag, you're just a guy being a guy. But drag no longer is necessarily or strictly about gender interpretation. You can be straight, you can be gay, and you can do drag. Doesn't matter. You can be male and do male presenting drag. You can be female and do female presenting drag. You can be anything in between and represent and depict anything in between as well in terms of your drag. Drag is no longer myopically limited to gender impersonation. And I think that's an amazing thing. And I think what he's doing with this game is marketing-wise smart, that he's taking the base common denominator. What's making drag so popular right now is the TV show that RuPaul is, all the TV shows that RuPaul is doing. So that's what people are going to be familiar with. So when you're looking to sell a physical product that costs money to make, you want to sell it to as many people as possible. So you take the common denominator. It doesn't represent what I would want to do in drag or with a contemporary drag game. I'd want something to be inclusive of drag kings, drag queens, and everything in between. And I would make it a cooperative game where instead of throwing shade at each other and trying to tear each other down as drag queens, we'd be trying to work and support and help each other to become the best drag artists that we can. And that's the sort of game that I would do, and I still consider it. And my plate is kind of full of design stuff right now, so maybe I'll get around to that. But I don't think, especially his game is not trying to tell our story for us. It's not even telling a story. It's literally depicting how the public sees drag because of the popularity of a TV show. So there's no story, so he's not trying to monopolize or anything or take advantage of our community. It's quite the opposite. And it's difficult. These are challenging times. We're going through a lot of change, a lot of growth and awareness and education has to take place. And I think it's up to us as queer gamers to try to not isolate ourselves and, well, if you're not gay, then you can't make a gay game. I would suspect that in general, queer people are going to make better queer games. Not necessarily, but that also shouldn't prevent anybody from making a good or fun game that's about queer folk. And if they're not queer, I'm okay with that because they're not speaking for me. I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself and putting a good product out there. So I think it would be nice to see more representation. It's nice to see that companies and organizations and conventions as well are taking this a lot more to heart. A little personal story is not last year. Last year was a pandemic. The year before, so 2019, I went and worked Gen Con, one of the biggest video game conventions in the world. For the first time, I'd never been before, and I went and worked for a dice company. And I have to honestly say, there were times at that 4 or 5 day convention, I thought, am I at Pride or am I at a nerd convention? I can't tell the difference because an organization or two or three had really pushed and helped make Gen Con more inclusive. Thousands of people were wearing ribbons with their pronouns on them attached to their name badges. The he, him, she, her, they, them. So many of them had little rainbow ribbons on top of that, and transgender ribbons attached to it, and pride ribbons. And it was super cool to see just how, and it wasn't just the queer people wearing these, it was so many, presumably straight, people wearing them too. And I thought that was marvelous how much progression has happened just in the past few years, and how much more inclusivity, and how some of these big organizations are striving to make sure that diversity and inclusion is happening. Um, I thought that was a bellwether of good things. Good things are happening, and it's up to those of us who are enjoying the benefits of being seen more and listened to, and being represented, to not shut ourselves off, but continue to embrace those who want to help lift up our voices. So that's where I am. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today. I never took my drink of coffee, so I'm going to do that. And we will chat with you next week on Game Speak. I don't know why I said it like that. It was weird, huh? Oh well.